Like I think that wow. Well, maybe you need like one of those things that just dissipates heat.
Yes.
I mean, they do pretty well.
Can you see that just fine in the switching of the slides, Jeremy?
Yes.
What happened there? It's so high. Well, if it's gonna have, I'm gonna be very frustrated because look, this is how it printed on mine. Oh, you see that? I didn't like have a slide with text overlapping itself. So, third committee, you just randomly on 2 lines, that's not really a big deal. Okay, so this is mostly fine, it's just like the one slide that's absolutely done. Well, we'll just have to deal. I added a little bit this time because I felt like chastising UNESCO and UNH a little bit. Everybody's on my naughty list.
The Archbishop when it's converted.
No, let's, you could pen drive it to me. I'll load them on our YouTube page so that you can watch them faster.
I don't have that.
You really can't
You mean
tell.
USB?
Well,
Yeah.
no, I guess,
Okay. I don't have one.
This is,
I don't have
this is
that.
definitely a different
I
font.
can get one upstairs and we'll do that
Oh.
portion.
It's a lot faster.
And then Portia,
So my guess is that
Julia's
this is a
not
font
speaking, so
that,
I'll
like,
speak to him for 5
I mean,
minutes
I
after
did
this
not give myself
presentation
this
before
font
we
for the record,
go
it
down
just
early
came
and
with
check in
something.
case it takes a little bit longer.
I didn't pick a
all
weird
the
font, I left as is
issuance
in the
emails printed off.
PowerPoint
Okay.
template, because
Yeah.
generally I
Okay,
think
so
that
it would be
works.
an hour pretty much.
But maybe I should have just, there's like,
I'm not here
there's
for
like
lunch.
a dozen fonts
but-
that like every computer
Just so
has,
you know.
that like kind of Microsoft
Okay.
will
Alright.
agreed at some point. They would include like Arial, Helvetica, Times New Roman, Georgia, I think Garamond actually might be one, you know, they might have slight little differences from operating system to operating system, but just apparently whatever the font is that was in that one is just not there. Which is fine. So. I just happened to be right on First Avenue. And I was like, wait, I should get a picture for use on like why is like things are linked to the UN. Because all the flags were blowing.
Perfect.
Yeah,
We went,
it was
they
very
rolled down
lucky.
yesterday.
I'm sorry?
We went to see yesterday, like this little
Yeah.
bit of it down.
Yeah. Well, if
Well,
it's
they're,
bad
they're
weather-
put up every morning and taken down every night.
Okay.
What's that?
And they're not put up if they know it's gonna be raining.
So flag quiz, guys, which choose? That's Korea, right, and then Russia.
Yeah, I think that's Qatar to like the Korea and Portugal. And then maybe
Pakistan, Australia.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you're right on.
see Philippines, Peru.
Well, we can also get an A from remembering that they are alphabetical.
Oh, yeah.
So that does also,
Iran.
this is, that's why Republic of Korea, right, not South Korea,
Romania.
technically, yeah.
Japan.
Next to
Also,
Romania.
this is like the DA hall from the outside.
Sweden, not Norway. I always get the Nordic flags confused. They're all the same, just different colors.
Yeah, I didn't actually know that until fairly recently, which is a little bit weird, but it just hadn't clicked, like I've seen all of them.
Right.
But I never put together that it really is just the colors that are different.
That's very
They're, yeah,
Nigeria.
yeah, and then it's Nigeria. Yeah, this is,
Go
we're
back.
going, yeah. And then, our flag is up because Palestine wanted its flag up, right? Yeah.
No, so before the
Second
Pope,
class.
before the Pope was coming, we were agnostic about the whole thing. But the state of Palestine really wanted their flag flying, so they included permanent observer states, and it was actually 8:00 in the morning, the day the Pope arrived, that the Holy See flag went up. Palestine had this big celebration, a lot of people there. We sent one of our interns there just to document that it was taking place. I'm very happy that the flag is flying of the Holy See, but our official position was to be agnostic about it.
Are we in alphabetical order or at the end?
We're at the
Second
end
last.
in alphabetical
So
order
first after the last.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're the first of the last.
of the last two.
Okay,
All right, here we are.
all right.
So you'll just tell me to advance slide, next slide.
Please. Go ahead. So basically, this is broken down into, some of the source things, some of the kind of major meetings. That's kind of first. I added in HIV/AIDS because I believe in sharing my suffering. And then some of the background to it, as well as like current challenges and issues. So the formatting changed a little bit, so apologies. Conventional elimination of all forms of discrimination against women would be kind of the biggest one in this section. Originally, when I first gave this presentation in January, it was just women, and now I'm realizing that everything is gender. So congrats, welcome to the gender sphere. So basically, this is the convention. CEDAW would be the short name. It was adopted in '79, entered into force in '81. That's usually how these things, you kind of hit a critical mass before a treaty enters into force. You got a lot of states parties. Both of those words are pluralized. This was a debate earlier in the year. Quite a few have reservations. Does anybody know what reservations are? Declarations on a treaty? This is like relevant, so it's helpful. Okay, not a problem. Basically, when you join a treaty, right, you're as a country, not us as individuals. We have not hit the level of juridical personality in international law where we sign treaties and it means something, okay? Which is like in my old job, we got like invited to sign a treaty. And what's the point? Doesn't matter unless countries do it, because sovereignty is a thing. Yeah, so reservations, basically there's a way that you can sign a treaty, but also kind of exempt yourself from a couple provisions of it. Now, that doesn't work equally in all treaties. Some treaties expressly say you can't reserve on these provisions, right? I don't think you can say like, oh, we're signing the treaty against torture, but actually torture is fine. In some, we reserve the right to torture people under specific circumstances, okay? There's also kind of rules about treaties. This would be in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Technically, a reservation, rules about reservations on treaties, where you're not supposed to, you can't issue a reservation that goes against the object and purpose of the treaty. So if that torture example would work perfectly, right? We're like, well, we exempt ourselves from having any obligation to this when it's like a political enemy. We can then torture people. That's really against the object and purpose of the torture treaty. There is a torture treaty, the Convention Against Torture. And so so on that basis, and other countries can object to it. It doesn't happen very often, but they can. In which case the reservation doesn't apply between those two countries, which gets into kind of weird technical area. But I would just say, like, note that that's a really significant number to say essentially on this treaty, we agree with the main stuff, but we're saying that in some areas we don't accept that particular provision. Technically, it's really about treaties. You will also see reservations happen on non-binding documents. We make reservations a lot on particular issues. You'll also see things like from a lot of Muslim countries, see anything in this that goes against Sharia law is not valid or something. You can make a very general one. Some of the big provisions for us would be, I'm sorry, it's a little bit small, but state parties take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in all matters relating to marriage and family relations, and in particular shall ensure on a basis of equality of men and women, the same rights to decide freely and responsibly on the number and spacing of their children, and to have access to the information, education, and means to enable them to exercise these rights. Okay, this is as close as it gets to anything about reproductive anything. So I think this is not inherently a problem, if it's done correctly. The issue is, what's this information, education, and means, right? So how does that interpreted is an issue. There's also kind of other things that address health and family planning. Got some other articles there. You don't have to look those up. Now, the other thing about treaties is that, especially in the human rights sphere, there's these treaty bodies that they're supposed to monitor, provide feedback. So there's usually kind of a reporting mechanism where every 4 years or so, depending on the treaty, every country that's a party to the treaty will say, here's how we're doing in meeting our treaty obligations. And that's reviewed by a committee. So you'd actually just call it CEDAW. I'm putting CEDAW committee to keep it clear here. That committee does not write the treaty. They don't rewrite the treaty. They don't have any binding authority, but they have a lot of persuasive authority. And they become, their recommendations can be used by activists in the countries themselves. They can be used to pressure in a donor aid context. And a lot of them kind of routinely go way beyond what the treaties actually call for, including CEDAW. So the CEDAW committee kind of regularly recommends decriminalizing abortion, expanding abortion access in countries with limitations. This is an example from that, this is to the Dominican Republic from 2013. We recommend that the state party, ensure that the draft amendment to the criminal code, which decriminalizes abortion in which the mother's life is threatened, will be adopted. So the expanding abortion access and extended to cover abortion in other circumstances such as rape, incest, and serious malformation of the fetus, which by the way is disability, right? In line with with our general recommendation number 24. CEDAW is not alone in doing this. You would be surprised. The International Covenant on the Committee on Civil and Political Rights, that treaty body will tell you that the right to life includes a right to abortion, which is bizarre, but that's what they're going to do. But that's the only really kind of big binding one in the women's rights area. One of the other big documents here for us is the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. It's the Fourth World Conference on Women. This is Hillary Clinton, erstwhile presidential candidate, former first lady in the 90s. She led the U.S. delegation, as I recall. This was basically a huge conference. It didn't come up with a treaty, but it came up with this non-binding platform for action. So basically a consensus document. It pulled a lot of things from a previous year's international conference on population development.
Sorry about that. I need to make sure I'm doing something.
ICPD had I don't know if we could get anywhere near as good as ICPD was right now. Let's put it that way. ICPD came up with a very delicate balance on life issues, where it basically said, if abortion's legal, it has to be safe. But it also said every country gets to set its own rules on whether it's legal, right? Which means that it's not a human right because you don't get to vote on human rights. You have to guarantee them, okay? So it's implicit in that. It also said things like we should reduce recourse to abortion, help women avoid repeated abortions. Abortion is not a method of family planning. So even though it accepts abortion as a possibility, it was generally pretty good in terms of respecting life on that, which is why we've had a hard time in these documents getting references into Beijing and ICPD that are good references to kind of limit it in that way. So,
sorry.
So this UN Women is the UN entity that's tasked with kind of assisting in its implementation. UN Women is actually kind of new as an entity. There were a whole bunch of other little ones. It's about 11 years old, I think. We've got some, but they do have in this document some problems for us. It's not perfect, nothing is. Where we're talking about, remove legal, regulatory, social barriers where appropriate to sexual and reproductive health education. So are we talking about, children with formal education programs for women's health issues? Then we've got, these are kind of our two big ones. I can tell you right now that the first part of 96 is in the HIV draft document. I raised that if they're going to put that, they should put this. We've had a lot of objections to the front, but basically it's a very different version of idea of sexual integrity and the human person. Okay, so we've got reproductive health doesn't get reached because we don't have enough knowledge about human sexuality, or poor quality reproductive health info and services. But then also things like high-risk sexual behavior. We talk about discriminatory social practices, attitudes about women, all sorts of things. Adolescents, particularly vulnerable because of their lack of information. Adolescents, that age range, according to UNAIDS, is 10 to 19, right? I'm just gonna say, I'm glad I didn't have a lot of information when I was 10. I think it was better for me. As a person, I think it's better for most people. And then we're talking about the distinct SRH needs. SRH is our short form for that, for older women and men. And then this is just a vision of like autonomy over here, right? Human rights include the right to have control over and decide freely and responsibly on matters related to their sexuality. This is not directly in any treaty, okay? This is like an interpretation, which means that we don't have to give it any credence, but unfortunately a lot of people do. You know, obviously we don't want coercion, we don't want discrimination, we don't want violence. It's not that there's no validity to it, but its vision of the person is really problematic, okay? So, and then the next part is, you know, equal relationships between women and men, right? Include full respect for the integrity of the person. That's a good part. Mutual respect, consent, shared responsibility for sexual behavior and its consequences. So I'm just like, that last part never gets into anything, right? The first part is in CSW this year. It's in the current HIV draft. God forbid we talk about, you know, consequences of sexual behavior or responsibility there. Sorry, I'm holding you up. We can go to the next one. Commission on the Status of Women. It reviews the Beijing progress every 5 years. Those are actually the better years for us because they kind of do like just a short declaration, which isn't as bad. The theme for this year's was actually about participation, decision-making in public life, and the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. Everything's very contentious and pretty biased. We got lucky this year. The facilitator honestly was not very ideological himself, so it was more even-handed than it might have been. They adopt agreed conclusions, which is actually a little bit above a resolution or a declaration. You know, we agree that this is what we're supposed to be doing. And they often include controversial stuff. So reproductive rights has been in these outcomes for years. And like, there are valid concerns about things like coercive sterilization or forced abortion or things like that, but that's not the right that they're thinking of. And that's not why they insist on its inclusion, okay? Now what we have is an effort to extend this, because even though, like, honestly, they're sore winners, they win at this like every year and it's not enough. So next month, there will be the second part of the Generation Equality Forum, which is now like basically a big gender party. It's bizarre, where they want to take things outside of the UN context, give a lot greater role to activist NGOs and individuals, and from that, then try to push that into things. So even though this isn't even finished, and actually before the first meeting in late March after CSW took place, there were efforts to put in references to this into UN documents that we were going to adopt, which is a way of incorporating by reference. You're kind of endorsing everything that comes out of this when you reference it like that. So that's, you know, a problem. This is a new slide on my current torture experience. I noticed that the Prevention Against Torture provisions don't necessarily apply in my context. Just kidding. That's it. I don't want to make light of torture, which is definitely a serious problem that sadly continues. Okay, we're in the high-level meeting on AIDS right now, HIV/AIDS. Every 5 years, this one has been held since 2001. They adopt a political declaration. Oftentimes the political declarations, because they're involving, like people from Capitol are more involved. You have ministers show up, obviously not this year in person, but sometimes that has kind of a mediating or moderating effect. It seems like it's not in this context. So 5 years ago, you know, it was like we were on the fast track to end HIV/AIDS, but we didn't meet the progress or it didn't meet all of the commitments that were in that declaration. Obviously, there have been improvements, but it didn't quite meet it. So now we're working on getting back on track and ending the inequalities, which are the only reason that there could be problems. And yet there was not a lot of reference to poverty in the first draft, right? So we put some things in. People from African Caribbean put some things in about that. You would think that the only inequality is basically people being mistreated because of their sexuality. And while that is not something that should happen, it's like not why people in sub-Saharan Africa are not getting AIDS treatment, okay? this is the one where we first got the closest we've had so far to language on comprehensive sexuality education. It doesn't actually use the term, it didn't use the term in 2016, but the kind of compromise that got in there where it described it in detail without using the term, then made it into the Commission on the Status of Women the next year, and has basically, with a few little changes, it actually got slightly better in CSW, which is weird, because CSW is not where anything goes to get better. We have that language now. So anything that we adopt here is going to have an effect other places. And a lot of these things do kind of relate. So there was an effort at the World Health Assembly. They were adopting something related to children and prevention of violence. And there was a push to include sexuality education in that. And someone in Geneva, one of the delegates there, basically said, well, in New York, the African group has accepted sex ed, which they haven't, to use that to pressure in Geneva. So these things really do relate a lot. That was like the WhatsApp scuttlebutt on that. And there's a lot of push to include kind of this non-agreed language on sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, whatever somebody's sexual orientation and gender, or how they understand their gender identity, they are obviously children of God. They should never be mistreated. Unfortunately, like it's given to us like an all or nothing package. Either you endorse everything about it, or you hate all those people, which of course is not true. We don't hate anyone who's struggling in those ways or who understands themselves in those ways. But this is not a term that has any definition in any agreed anything anywhere in international law. And so the push is basically we're going to shove this in here, and we're going to shove in a term that has no legitimacy and then use that to legitimate it in every other area. Okay, so that's really the big issue there, and that's hopefully this is like we're going to have a bad outcome. I think we'll see what happens with it. It should be concluding today, and we'll see the draft tomorrow. Final draft. It's been a very bad process, not very fair, but we'll see what happens. Next is third committee. So this is one of the main committees under the General Assembly. It focuses on social, humanitarian, cultural issues, including human rights. I don't have as much experience about this. As I said, I came in January, and it really takes place in the fall. I followed CSW like a lot in my old role. HIV is newer to me, but now I've been through it, so I'm an expert. Just kidding. But there's a lot more that the third committee addresses in this. These are just the ones relevant in this particular topic, right? Because we get into youth and aging, don't maybe seem as related, okay? But this is, in the youth context, we're seeing a lot about sexuality education. If you didn't know, it could solve every problem that society might have. And then aging is actually becoming a way to promote kind of sexual rights, which also have no definition anywhere. And there is a push in CSW, and there's been one in the HIV declaration to kind of create sexual rights as a category where it doesn't, like we have reproductive rights in Beijing and the Cairo ICPD context. It's not an official binding definition, but it is something that was agreed on. We don't have any of that in the sexuality stuff. It's just too new. Okay. Next one, please. And then also, I'm sure Julia talked a lot about the SDGs, yes? Yeah, so you're basically experts. But the ones that are important in my sector, in my areas are 3.7 and 5.6. I get health too, because that's fun. So 3.7, universal access to sexual reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information, and education. So this is where you can justify sexuality education, and the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. Now, on its face, like it's workable, but somehow everything seems to be about contraceptives, which, that's a whole, there's basically a big push to say that all sorts of women want contraceptives, but they can't get them. But when you actually poll the women in global south, their developing countries, very few of them cite lack of access for why they're not using it. So don't buy that excuse. But the number keeps jumping. It was like 215 million, now it's like 228 million women lack access to contraceptives or have an unmet need for contraceptives. But that's how they're going to measure their success under that goal. What percentage of women 15 to 49, so including children, are using contraceptives, right? So you have targets, we have goals, then we've got targets, and then how do you measure it? Those are called the indicators, okay? Target 5.6, universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights as agreed in accordance with ICPD Program of Action and Beijing Platform for Action. Now, our issue is these outcomes of their review conferences. These often kind of go beyond the original agreements. So I fight a losing battle on this all the time to get rid of that reference. Somehow it gets in a lot. Documents is a little bit better than just outcomes, which is, we have both in the HIV resolution right now, political declaration right now. But this also, they have, I think, some weird indicator on this, like the percentage of women and girls 15 to 49 who make their own decisions. Like, how do you even measure that? It's bizarre. Like, I don't think any actual stats person would think that that's measurable in that way, but you know, fine. And next, this is I say key players, the subtitle is like groups that frustrate me on a regular basis. I have a slightly ruder term for that I won't use. But yeah, so UN Women, technically it's the UN Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. So anybody here know who Michelle Bachelet is?
Yes.
Yeah, she is now the
Previously, he was the president of Chile, but
Yes.
now he's something in the UN. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Right now, she's the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She was the president of Chile. She was the president of Chile before that in a separate term, and in between, she was the head of UN Women. And in her second term as president of Chile, she went back and oversaw a push for expanding grounds for abortion in Chile. Okay. So in case you are like, don't think anybody's neutral on this, on these areas. And I'm not saying there's like that people are evil or something, right? Don't get me wrong. But as entities, they very much lean very heavily in one direction. UNFPA, I'm sorry, that's a mistake on the slide, they're not an advocacy and coordinating body. Their big push is, they do a lot with maternal health, but they also do a lot with contraceptives. And they seem to think that it's a solution to everything. During the kind of Zika crisis, they had some like very well-written article basically showing that the only way to avoid problems was to make sure that everybody in Brazil in particular had, you know, contraceptives. UNAIDS basically wrote the draft that I have in the HIV political declaration. They are not a scientific body themselves. They coordinate between different UN entities. They do get data from countries, but then they draw their own kind of conclusions, and their conclusions seem to all be that you can't talk about anything in a way that might suggest that any sort of behavior puts you at greater risk. They actually, and also they're part of the general push against motherhood, which they are not being honest about. They claim that it suggests stigma. It might stigmatize women or mothers if you talk about mother-to-child transmission because maybe they're responsible for it. I don't really buy that, and like I don't think most people would buy that. But you know. And then we've got the treaty bodies, which I've mentioned. This is the HRC Human Rights Committee, and then you've got others, Committee Against Torture, things like that. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is the secretariat for those. So the fact that we've got Michelle Bachelet at the head and they're providing all the support services, you know, don't think that anybody who's like the guys, the ambassadors who are co-facilitating the HIV/AIDS things, I don't think they're writing the first drafts, right, which are called zero drafts. Okay, these are being written by largely secretariat related bodies. Sorry, next one. Then this is some of the things that I just wanted to raise this. This is a new edition, okay, because of what's kind of coming up. We talked a little bit about binding law. Of course, sources for that would be treaty. Another one would be customary law. That's a little bit wobbly. Think like the things that are most well established in customary law are now mostly in treaties anyway, but there is a way of basically saying we've done this for a long time. We all treat it like a rule, so it's a rule. They're obligatory for the state parties, but of course you do have reservations. What's the other problem with treaties? How do you enforce a treaty? Black books are because it's really hard actually to enforce a treaty, right? The old school way of enforcing a treaty obligation that wasn't met is called invade the country that didn't do it, okay? It's like start a war, right? It's you know, not anybody's first recourse, you would hope, but you know, the old way of enforcing obligations in the is basically or some sort of economic sanctions, things like that, cut off trade or what have you. It's really tough to enforce. So that's where the treaty bodies are supposed to kind of assist on that by providing feedback. But unfortunately, they're all like really co-opted and political at this point. So even though I'm sure that even though they definitely have some good points, they raise valid criticisms, they're also raising things that have nothing to do with the treaties. You're not really supposed to read into a treaty's provisions, but they will read into a treaty's provisions, that the right to health includes basically sex ed for teenagers and children, or contraceptive access and youth-friendly healthcare services that don't involve parental consent. So that's if the enforcement issue is it's tough. You can't really enforce very well. And we're trying to avoid wars now, despite what you look at around the world and see. But they have a lot of persuasive authority. So when this august body from the United Nations says you have an obligation to do that, it does put a lot of pressure. Okay. We also have non-binding declarations, things of political will. So that would be ICPD, Beijing, all of these resolutions, declarations, et cetera, that we're working on now. So they don't create any actual obligations. So why is this twice? Oh, I'm sorry, guys. That's supposed to be non-negotiated documents. I will fix that on the third one. So why do we care about these if they don't actually create any obligations? Why would we care? Why does that matter?
Function like standards, universal, like for member states, if we have to make internal laws, we can adopt these standards and affect them.
Yeah, they can have a lot of persuasive authority, right? They also can influence a lot of the development aid funding, right? So we agree that, we agree in this HIV context that comprehensive sexuality education is essential for stopping the spread of AIDS, which is the claim, bizarrely. Then when it comes to, when USAID or European Development Aid or whatever, says we're going to fund HIV programs in your country, well, what are they going to fund? They can look right at the declaration and say, and we would like to assign this to, sexuality education. This is some examples of how these things are misused. The other thing that I'm sorry, the slide had a mistake, but it's also non-negotiated documents. We're seeing a lot of use of Secretary General's reports. UNAIDS strategy was basically the source for a lot of what we're seeing in the HIV thing. So it's not negotiated, and it's kind of treated like it's some sort of incredibly reliable, unbiased, neutral source, and they're not. You keep getting pushed in. This is just an example from Sex Ed. This is the UNESCO technical guidance. So they're citing ICPD, the 2030 agenda, comments from the Human Rights Council, Committee on the Rights of the Child, that's for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the ICESCR. They're basically citing these committees and these non-binding documents as if they're somehow creating an international binding standard, but they're not. Next slide, please. So, if you ever heard the expression, when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail? Every problem can be solved with contraception, abortion, and sex ed if you really try hard enough. So this would be the big one, would be sexual and reproductive health and rights. This is from the WHO. This is what they're putting out on Safe Abortion Day, which is somehow a day. It's in late September. Don't commemorate it. So basically, reproductive rights advocate member states who support that, they promote abortion like every forum. It's the solution to everything. It'll fix education, health stuff, early marriage. I don't know how it undoes an early marriage, but apparently it does. It's important in environmental stuff. Then you've got, of course, UN entities. They say that they're like neutral on these things because the member states haven't agreed, but in practice, they're always pushing it. And the treaty monitoring bodies do the same thing. Next slide, please. Then we also get this big thing about contraception. I've already touched on this unmet need for family planning. Basically, the only way that women can be equal in schooling, in work, is if they can delay childbearing. And the best and only way to really do that is through modern methods of contraception. And somehow it's also going to be part of preventing sexually transmitted infections, even though it might lead people to less responsible sexual behavior. And it's also really hard to enforce like using hormonal contraceptives and a barrier method. And actually hormonal contraceptives increase, particularly adolescent girls, susceptibility to STIs. But you know, we'll ignore that. So this is our 225 million women don't have it. You might hear more in the COVID context because apparently a lot of women, they're expecting something like 1 million pregnancies that wouldn't have happened otherwise because of contraceptive and lack of availability or lack of contraceptive access. But actually, I just saw from UNICEF that a lot of that was women not going to the clinics to get the stuff because they were afraid of COVID. So we can send all the contraceptives if we want. They don't go to pick it up. You know, that's like, it's not a supply issue. Then we've got family and complementarity. UDHR, our great document, recognizes family as a natural and fundamental group unit of society, entitled to protection by society and the state. Family comes first, guys, then you get society and the state. But it's really viewed as like a patriarchal tool of oppression for women and children. All been oppressed as children by the family. This was something that did take me by surprise in CSW being in the room this year, was total opposition to using the word mother. Like, it's offensive and limiting to women. There's also a big push to erode parental rights, like how dare parents keep their children from having this, you know, scientifically accurate information about sexuality, but a lot of it goes into stuff that's really inappropriate. Next, please. SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity. This is a set of stamps sold by the UN for, you know, like, I don't think they, a number of countries were annoyed, like, were upset at these stamps. The UN was basically issuing an endorsement of sexual orientation, gender identity things. But this is now creeping into, like, we haven't like resolved all the issues related to women's equality, but now it's not women's equality, it's gender equality, right? And we're seeing things like, we can't even talk about violence against women right now. The push is to say gender-based violence, which I don't think is comprehensive, and which to me is a way of including non-women, even if they may think that they are women. So, and then sex ed, you know, lots of problematic content. Key idea, ages 5 to 8. Important to understand the difference between biological sex and gender. I don't really think that's healthy for like a 5-year-old's personal development. But we were informed that this is really necessary to stop the spread of HIV/AIDS, and you know, they kept bringing in like UNAIDS to tell us all this stuff. It's very annoying. Then they say, you know, this is for what's the age group on this? It's not the 5-year-olds. This one is, I think it's 12 to 15. It might be 9 to 12. How can we, you know, just reduce the risk of acquiring or transmitting HIV? You know, so we're talking about condom use, pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis. Can a child describe the steps to use it correctly? You know, what age, vaccine for HPV? That's, you know, unfortunately that's kind of stuck in here with that. And then, you know, something that, you know, it's good to be able to counter unwanted sexual pressure. But also asserting the intention to practice safer sex. There's acknowledging it actually can't be totally safe through condoms and contraceptives. Okay, so for us, wait, too fast. So first of all, and this really does touch on all the areas I've just addressed, human dignity, inviolable from conception until natural death. So SRHR, completely unacceptable, right? As is any other term or understanding that promotes abortion. Obviously, contraceptives are related to that, but not quite in the same category there. Family, fundamental to society, essential for integral human development. We are not born into, like, we're not like birthed in pods with no relations to anybody. Just because some families may have struggles or may not do a good job of taking care of their children doesn't mean we should view the family or every family as a problem. We should be protecting and nurturing it. Complementarity of the sexes, part of God's design for humanity. We have to accept women in our totality. So not just productive dimensions, because like all the stuff about family life in the CSW this year was pretty much about like maternity leave and then also getting women back into the workforce. Because, you know, you have like a set amount of time with your kid, but then go be productive for society. But also, you know, we should be accepting fertility, motherhood. Don't treat family planning as synonymous with contraception. That's not what that means. And we should also, be promoting natural methods. And then, of course, motherhood is a gift to society. It's not just a burden on society. Okay, so that was a lot of talking. Yes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
For question.
I was kind of talking about this with David yesterday, and maybe it's a question too for Father Roger, but it seems like a lot of this stuff is just so objectionable. It's kind of a twofold question. One is being only a permanent observer. What are the ways you can say like this is like really heinous stuff, and what can we do to like combat it, and how much power like do we actually have in kind of lodging complaints or raising the issues? And the second part is if full membership was offered to the UN, why, after like a period of discussion, did the Holy See reject it? Was it just kind of like we were kind of guessing to stay above the fray, or yeah? I guess those are my two questions.
The first.
So it is a challenge for sure to try to prevent the inclusion of these things. The fact that we are not a member state does limit our ability, for example, to block things, although it's hard for any one country to do that. But there are member states that agree with us, and that we can be kind of kind of the flag leading the charge in a way, and helping that way. Our continued objections give strength to those objections, and a lot of times we work really hard on studying the texts. The countries that are most aligned with us often are stretched pretty thin, whereas these issues are like our big priority. It's not the only thing we care about, but it's so we can be basically flagging those things and helping in that way. We also have really good reasons. I like to think we give explanations. We're not necessarily like I'm not raising every time we have SRHR that this is about abortion. Actually, we don't really do that a lot. We say it's not agreed in international law. This is a very controversial issue. It doesn't belong in here. And then that's kind of a rallying point for countries that share that value. I don't know. I would, if I were going to guess on the observer thing, my guess is that it does kind of keep us out of the political side of things a little bit more. We are only allowed as an observer to co-sponsor resolutions that relate to us, which kind of saves us from having to like say yes or no to a lot of other things. I probably don't want to add on that.
The reasons weren't publicly given back in 2004, but the basic line of it was there were pros and cons for either side,
Right.
but the pros to remaining an observer were stronger. Insofar as if you remember when we were going through the Holy See at the UN, we were talking about the real principles of engagement, that we're not doing it at a military level, economic level, political level, but trying to articulate the principles that can bring opposing parties together. The conclusion was that we could do that more effectively as an observer. Sometimes people ask, well, why wouldn't you become a full member state and then abstain? It's really hard to abstain from a whole bunch of things because people would use it politically. If you were abstaining from something against torture against women simply because you don't want to regularly choose yes or no on this issue, you'd be pulled into it. Some people were arguing at the same time that one of the component parts of the Lateran Treaty in 1929 with Italy, which prevents the Holy See from engaging in any activity that could be harmful to Italy, especially militarily, that might at some level eventually be present at the United Nations. And so some were saying that was a reason why the Holy See would remain politically neutral in that way.
There are a lot of areas where we would probably have to take a position that would, on the surface level, look very problematic, right? Like I haven't engaged in this yet, but one of my areas would be universal jurisdiction, which is basically crimes against humanity. Obviously, we're not in favor of crimes against humanity, but we are in favor of like a strict reading of the law, right? So then you could have a situation where it looks like you're letting off a really bad guy or something, but it's so it does kind of help you influence some of those sticky situations. Yes, I'm sorry, I speak very quickly. I was only living in New York for about 6 years.
Quick questions,
Yeah.
both of them out, and then she'll take both of them.
So, what does the ODC think about the Istanbul Convention against the violence?
And hold, and hold that one, Diego, your question?
Yeah, if it is long, maybe we can leave it for the middle, but basically it's the practical part. So how into a declaration is the process to amend the text, and how there is the difference between permanent observer and the ability to do so, how that works.
Gotcha, okay. We have serious concerns about the Istanbul Convention. So Istanbul Convention is ostensibly about violence against women. Obviously, we oppose violence against women, but it has some problematic provisions related to, I think, to family and sexuality. I haven't read into it enough myself. It's really something that's handled more in the European context, but we definitely have concerns, which is, on how things work. So it depends, there are some variations across the process, but basically we can participate in the negotiations pretty much like a member state. We just, to a certain extent, there can be pressure, like Julia was completely ignored in one process in the fall. I had the EU basically saying, you know, we should ignore observer states, which is hilarious because the EU is also an observer. But they have countries that are, you know, that are full members, obviously. But they, so basically you get the draft. Sometimes you have a reading first and then you put in written comments, or you can put in written comments and you've got a reading. But in essence, you start going through the text as a group and kind of raising objections. In CSW, we pretty much had the text up on the screen the whole time. Now we're doing this virtually right now, but they would put the text up on the screen in the rooms as well. For HIV, they never put the text on the screen, which to me is very shady. Because basically we could give comments, but we weren't really the ones kind of writing or working on the text. It was the facilitators, which meant it was Q&As.
But the amendments were voted?
So amendments come after the draft is kind of finalized. That you can then, a member state, we couldn't make an amendment. A member state, once it's presented for adoption, could then propose an amendment. We had something a week ago on like the resolution about which NGOs were going to be allowed to participate in this high-level meeting on HIV, which is next week. And India had an amendment to allow one more group in, which got voted on. But that happens at the time when it's presented.
But he's also asking about changes over the course of the negotiations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that we're part of, basically we can say we want this change. If other countries express support for that, then it can get in. It also kind of depends on the facilitator's approach.
Mm-hmm.
So we basically make a lot of proposals, and if member states support it, then it might get in. But it's on the controversial issues. It does tend to be damage control. Where the other thing is, like in CSW, there were a huge number of proposals to put in reproductive rights, like everywhere, which means that we have to fight all of them. Which also then means that, like, if we get, 40 out of 41 out, they still basically win because that one reference is, keeps it in, and it's a big problem. So it's very challenging on that. But that's a strategic point from Western countries, is to basically overload the text with these references so that in the end we, succeeded in getting it out, but we didn't really get it out.
It's rare that there's a vote on anything. Paragraphs could theoretically be voted on, which is rare, as well as the entire document could be voted on.
But that will all happen when it's presented for adoption.
But that's rare. Normally, all the major disagreements are worked out and it's proposed as accepted. There's a whole section in here about how those things work that we can talk.
Basically, you go through the 80 versions of the text. And we'll have, here's the proposal for this, here's the proposal of that. Maybe you try to strike a deal. We have a lot of concerns about the references to girls in CSW, and that girls' economic empowerment could suggest like working for children. Child labor is a bad thing, we oppose it. So, we had some of those tweaks were where we just kind of found the middle ground. Okay, so when we talk about, we can talk about women and girls for all of these things, but not girls for that thing, where it comes to autonomy or the economic stuff.
Yes. Again, on the convention. But why doesn't the receive support the convention with provisions?
Oh, with reservations?
Yeah, with reservations. Wouldn't it be a way?
I wasn't involved in the decision, so I'm a little bit wary of like giving an answer. But I think, the problem is when the Holy See signs something, I think it does give a lot of moral weight to it. And if we have kind of very fundamental concerns, I'm not in the Secretary of State making that decision, but if I were, I would be very concerned that we would lend a lot of legitimacy to something that pretty much every like Catholic NGO, all those things, all those organizations that are pro-life, pro-family, kind of particularly in the European context, they're all opposing it out of those deep concerns, and we'd be really undercutting them on that by lending it a lot of legitimacy, even if we issued reservations on those particular provisions. So that's just my speculation, though. I don't know if that was the thought process.
So it's just because I think that in case there is it would support the main message of the convention. So and
But that's an interesting point too, because that's a little bit of the human rights creep, right? Not you, but the idea that everything has to have if it's not a human right, it doesn't matter or it's not valuable, right? That's part of the idea behind that whole issue is that only things that are codified as individual rights in the human rights context have value or meaning, right? So, but like I actually said this to an Austrian delegate. It was like, there's no human right to love. Right? You could never, if you create a right to that, then that creates an obligation for somebody to do it. But that's kind of against the nature of love itself, right? And yet love is the thing that human beings need most in this world. You need it for healthy development, all those sorts of things. We codify certain like parental duties, but we could never create that as a right in and of itself. So it's not, I would suggest that we maybe step back a little bit and think whether everything has to be codified in a treaty to be supported or to be recognized as valuable.
Okay, everybody. Thank you, Nadia. We're gonna move on to the next thing as well. Thanks very much, Nadia, for the two presentations today. A lot of hard work. We're gonna meet for 5 minutes and then we're gonna go get your IDs. So I want to go through a couple of things with it. So every time you use your ID when you go to the United Nations, it pops up on the screen of whichever security guard is there. So part of the joy of the gospel is when they see the name Holy See with any face, that face is smiling. So when you go for your photo today, I don't care if your culture is one of these types of things like you never smile as if you're in a group surrounded by terrorists or anything else like that. But I want you really to smile, and they'll ask you, do you like your photo? And if you're not smiling, say, I need to take it again with a smile. I'm serious about this, but like there's these little things matter. So smile when you get your photo. Guys, you're going to be dressing with your suit coat when you go on in. You'll need another form of ID just to show you are who the paper holder is. And Portia will have the documents that you're going to need there. Let's try to do this as hastily as we can to get down to the office. It's right outside the UN where the Pass and ID office is. Be friendly always whenever we're with UN personnel. So how are you today? Good. Thank you very much for your help. That type of stuff that we regularly engage in. So your passport will be fine. Some other photo ID, national photo ID is sufficient to prove that you are the one with that piece of paper that's going to be going on down. Hopefully you're back here in an hour. When you are back, we'll continue with some stuff before lunch. We were hoping to have Julia this morning on one of her talks, but Julia's under the weather. We'll see if we can recover her later, but I'm going to take one of my talks from tomorrow, the remaining topics and loose ends, and try to cover as much as we can here so that we would have the chance, if she's feeling better tomorrow, to have her give that presentation. Otherwise, tomorrow I'll do the best job that I can with the presentation she's given. Questions on any of that? Second thing is, I did like a couple loose ends. With regard to the elevator, if you're ever taking the elevator, it's always 3 stories. The rule for, unless you're sort of carrying big boxes or stuff. So from the ground floor, you would ordinarily not take it up to the 2nd floor. There are a couple reasons for that. A, the elevators are old and we don't want to pay $600,000 to get them fixed. B, if the interns start taking elevators, then guys like Monsignor Franco at 89 years old don't get on the elevator because there are already 6 people on. So a little bit like that. Now, if you happen to break a leg and you're on crutches, rules change. But in general, unless you were going to the 3rd or 4th floor from the ground floor, you'd in general take the stairs. Not that there was an issue with that yesterday. Do you have questions on anything we've covered up until now before you go on your journey?
I have a question, but it was regarding the last thing. So
Okay, we'll have a chance for those types of practical issues that anybody has. Okay, so 5 minutes you'll be leaving with Portia to get your IDs. Just get a photo ID with you. And Jeremy, I'll send you an email when we're about ready to go. We wouldn't be meeting for an hour, at least. And then, but I mean, it might be closer to 12:30, et cetera, but just I'll send you something when we're ready to go.
Okay, thank you
Okay.
very much. Yep.
See you later.
See you later.